So I grew up in a small place called Hannah Ridge, southern Wyoming. We are probably most famous for being the not-so-final resting place of Dippy the dinosaur, whose skeleton now lives in the Carnegie Museum of Natural Sciences in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There are some hot springs just outside of town, and Butch Cassidy robbed a train just a couple of miles away on the first cross-country railroad. But aside from that, there is not much here beyond dust, gravel, trees, and a few trailers. I was raised by a single mom, and while words like strict and rules did not really exist in her vocabulary, there was one thing she told me to never, ever do, and that was to never go anywhere near the house of Walter Crowley. Walter Crowley lived in a trailer right on the edge of town, and he made his living going through other people's trash to find things he could sell or repurpose for resale. He only ever did it at night, and even when people caught him, half of them were too scared to say anything, because people believed he had killed someone and gotten away with it. Mom told me he was a monster, and that the kid he had killed had been a close friend of hers in high school. That was all she ever told me about it, though. I figured it was just because it hurt too much to talk about. Over the years, I picked up bits and pieces here and there about Walter Crowley's life and the murder he was said to have escaped punishment for. I learned he fought in Vietnam and that he volunteered for it too. But after he came back home, he just could not return to normal. He moved his trailer out near Coldwater Reservoir, and people said to never go around to the north side at night, because Walter Crowley would likely be out there shooting squirrels for the next night's dinner. You would not want him mistaking you for a squirrel. The older folks would say it with a look in their eyes that made it clear they were serious. Still, everyone acted like they were afraid of him. Some people even seemed to pity him. I remember hanging out with a Mark of mine when we were both about 14, and his mom was giving us a ride somewhere when he brought up Walter Crowley. My friend talked about him like he was the boogeyman, but all his mom had to say was, "That poor man, all he wants is to be left alone." Now my friend Mark was like, "Mom, he killed someone." And I saw this strange switch in her, like she was putting on a mask as she said that he did, and that I'd better stay the heck away from his trailer, young man. And it felt like we had, I don't know, caught her off guard about something. I just didn't fully understand what that something was until a few years later, and by the time I was 17, Walter Crowley was definitely the devil to me. One night, my mom had gotten drunk and told me the story of how Walter Crowley killed her friend. She wasn't an alcoholic or anything. She just liked to have a few wine coolers on a Friday night while watching Dallas and Falcon Crest. But then one night, I got home from a friend's place and found her all teary-eyed, looking at old pictures of herself and her high school friends, including the kid Walter Crowley had supposedly murdered. She told me how they used to hang out at school, and sometimes outside of school too, since two mutual friends were dating. And she said that, aside from partying a little too much, he was a good guy and didn't deserve to die that way, or at such a young age. He'd been drinking out near that lake with a couple of friends when he wandered off to take a leak in the bushes. And that's when he saw someone walking through the shrubs, carrying what looked like a little kid over their shoulder. Mom's friend yelled something at the guy, who started running off with a kid over his shoulder. So he and his buddies decided to give chase. And once they caught up with him, with Mom's friend out in front, the guy dropped the kid, spun around, and opened fire. Bang, 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 and the poor guy was dead before he hit the dirt. The kid they rescued, a young girl, was taken to the hospital, but she later passed away because she had a massive dose of tranquilizers in her system, and it had damaged her organs. All the kids who were hanging out at the lake that night said it was Walter Crowley who shot Mom's friend. But for some reason, he was never arrested and never went to jail, and it finally made sense to me why everyone either feared him or hated him. Maybe my friend Mark's mom didn't know the full story, and that was why she said that strange thing about that poor man. But I did, and as the months went by, all that hatred for him kept festering until finally, I decided I was going to do something about it. I had already told my friends about the whole thing, so they knew how much I hated Walter Crowley for leaving my mom with this lifelong trauma. But it wasn't until we were sitting around the campfire one night that I finally brought up the idea of doing something about it. One of my buddies had asked his dad about the little kid who died from the overdose, and he confirmed that it was true. People didn't like talking about it because you never knew when the girl's mom might show up behind you in a store or somewhere else. The only part that didn't match the story he heard was that the kid had been found in town instead of near the lake. That small detail didn't matter to us, though. It didn't matter to me at all. The story was still basically the same, and Walter Crowley still needed to pay for what he'd done all those years earlier. So that night, I came up with a plan with my buddies. I was going to hike out to his trailer in the middle of the night, watch it for a while to make sure no one was awake or moving around, and then I was going to set it on fire. Yes, I know, it was a dumb idea. I could have killed the guy, but at the time, in my head, I was just going to light his trailer on fire and then run off, and he would wake up, run outside, and stand there angry before having to move somewhere else. But I was incredibly young and incredibly stupid, so things didn't turn out like that at all. It also took a while before I felt brave enough to get the fuel I needed to do it. I didn't have any money, not at all. So I ended up stealing a can of paint thinner from our school's art supplies. Then, one Friday night, after hanging out with my buddies around the campfire like we always did, I lied and told them I was heading home when I was really going to Walter Crowley's place. It took about an hour of walking around the lake to reach the other side. Once I was within maybe half a mile, I turned off my flashlight and followed the water's edge until I spotted a light coming from Walter Crowley's trailer in the distance. I stuck to the plan and watched the place for about 40 to 45 minutes until the sound of a TV stopped and the dim light I could see went out. I waited another minute or two until everything was quiet and still. Then I pulled the can of paint thinner from my backpack and started creeping toward Walter Crowley's trailer. My heart was pounding by the time I got within a few feet, and the fact that the trailer was still silent made me think I had crept up completely undetected. But then, just as I was about to pop the lid off my can of paint thinner, I suddenly heard a loud click to my right that I instantly recognized as a gun before someone said, "What you got there, boy?" I froze, knowing it was Walter Crowley, and that he had caught me red-handed trying to burn down his place. I didn't want to say what was in my hands, because I figured that once he knew what I planned to do, he would just blow my brains out without a second thought. And so, I didn't say anything. Walter Crowley then told me to drop what I was carrying, and when I dropped the can, I saw the beam of a small flashlight hover over it. As Walter Crowley realized what I was trying to do, he told me to turn around because he wanted to see my face before he killed me. But again, my body didn't seem willing to respond. I was shaking by the time he rushed me and spun me around. But when he saw my face, he shoved me away from him. So I fell over backward, and then he just looked at me for a minute after lowering his gun. I was so scared that even though I wanted to beg him not to kill me, the words wouldn't come out. Then, out of the blue, he said my name out loud to confirm it was me. I went from terrified to extremely confused and terrified. He knew my name, and he knew who my mom was, too. And then, after I confirmed who I was, he told me, "I wondered how long it would be before you showed up." The first words out of my mouth that whole time came out as, "How'd you know me?" And then, after inviting me inside his trailer, Walter Crowley promised to tell me everything I wanted to know. After we sat down in his trailer, he asked what my mom had told me about him. I guess I got a little braver, because I told him all about how I hated him for killing my mom's friend. He asked me to tell him how I thought it went down, and he just smiled as I repeated my mom's version of events. He didn't interrupt at all, but when I was done, he told me, "Okay, kid, this is what really happened." My mom's friend was a very troubled guy growing up, and as much as people tried to help him, he only got worse as he aged into his teens. He was expelled from school for stealing panties out of the girls' locker room. He got in trouble with the cops for supposedly flashing a group of middle schoolers and only ended up charged with a lesser crime because he claimed he was peeing. And in the months before he was murdered, he had been seen talking to kids around town and said he was just playing with them when confronted by their parents. On the night he was murdered, it was Walter Crowley walking near the lake with a kid over his shoulder. It was my mom's friend. And in reality, the whole situation happened in almost complete reverse. Walter Crowley had been out hunting squirrels, as he often did, when he suddenly came across a group of drunk teenagers walking by the lake at night. It was a full moon, so he could see them as clearly as day moving through the shrubbery, and he followed them to make sure they weren't headed toward his trailer for some reason. Walter Crowley stalked the kids along the edge of the lake, listening to them hoot, holler, and laugh. When he realized one of them was carrying something over his shoulder, something that looked disturbingly like a kid with long, glossy hair that shined in the moonlight, Walter Crowley closed the distance a little more and heard the group of kids planning to do something awful with what he realized was an unconscious child. As soon as he heard that, Walter Crowley flicked on his flashlight and told them to drop the child. The guy carrying the kid was my mom's old high school friend. But instead of dropping the kid and running, he pulled out a knife and was halfway to driving it into the kid's chest when Walter Crowley put a couple of .22s through his chest and dropped him dead. Walter Crowley said he didn't get a good look at the kids who ran off, but at least one of them was almost certainly a girl. He then picked up the unconscious kid, walked her all the way into town, and dropped her off at the old gas station where a clerk was working the night shift. The clerk called 911, but Walter Crowley didn't stick around. He just told the clerk there was a body out near the lake and that the cops should stop by Walter Crowley place because he was the one who did it. The cops stopped by the very next morning and took Walter Crowley into custody. But his story checked out, and the missing girl's parents were too relieved to have her home to do anything but thank him. To them, Walter Crowley was a hero, but according to him, he never felt like one. When he got back from Vietnam, Walter Crowley promised himself he'd never hurt another human being as long as he lived. That was half the reason he lived out in the sticks. If he'd been able to save that girl's life, it might have made it all worth it. But she was probably already dying from the tranq dew from the moment he first saw her. So all killing my mom's friend did was help a sick individual escape justice for his crimes. But what made him sick to his stomach and made it feel like twice the waste was how the others got away with it. That was the reason he stayed away from town, because he couldn't stand being around the grown-up versions of the little monsters who escaped any consequence for ending that girl's life. He didn't know exactly who they were, but he believed there was a pretty good chance my mom was one of them. Walter Crowley said he didn't care whether I believed him or not. He only wanted me to do him one favor: go home, tell my mom what he had just told me, then look her straight in the eye after asking if it was all true or not. Well, I did exactly that. And while it's best not to describe, moment by moment, how that brief exchange unfolded, let's just say our relationship never recovered. And she's the reason I haven't been back to southern Wyoming plains in almost 20 years now. Back in 2002, my boyfriend and I were driving from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to a small town in South Dakota called Vermilion, where his parents lived. Around noon, we'd been cruising through Iowa cornfields for hours when suddenly the corn just sort of ended. It felt like stepping out of a forest into open land, except instead of green grass, all we could see was ash and charcoal. There had clearly been some kind of fire, and while my boyfriend said it was normal for farmers to burn their fields sometimes to prepare for a new cycle or something like that, it still looked creepy as hell. We went from only being able to see a few feet on either side of the highway to being able to see for miles around us. And that was why it was so easy to notice the man and the little boy I saw walking hand in hand through a burned-out cornfield. I could only see them from a distance at first, but the contrast between them was obvious, and it looked unsettlingly wholesome. It resembled some old-timer taking his grandson out for a walk, maybe to show him the burned fields. And then, as I kept watching them from afar, I realized they were heading toward what looked like an old well. I didn't mention it to my boyfriend at all. We were enjoying a comfortable stretch of quiet while listening to some music, so I just watched that Hallmark card scene grow closer as we drove on, almost in silence. And by the time the two of them reached the well, I could see both of them in almost perfect detail. I could see the old man wearing dungarees with a small patch of dark, thinning hair on the top of his head. I could see the little boy's blue shirt, his white sneakers, and his almost white blonde curly hair. And then, as we drove straight past them, I saw it as clear as day when the old man picked up the little boy and threw him down the well. I remember screaming, "Oh my God!" at the top of my lungs in the seconds after I saw it. As my boyfriend panicked and asked what the hell was going on, I started digging frantically through my bag for my cell phone. I briefly considered telling him to stop the car, but an image flashed through my mind of us lying dead in that field, riddled with gunshot wounds. So I told him to keep driving and said that a kid had just been thrown down a well. He said, "What? What are you talking about?" Because he'd been zoned out, his eyes fixed on the road, and he hadn't seen anything. But once I explained in more detail what I had witnessed, he asked if I was absolutely sure I wasn't mistaken, and he said he understood why I was so shaken. I eventually managed to find my cell phone, but when I pulled it out and unlocked it, I saw that I had exactly 0 bars. So I did the next best thing and grabbed our map to see where the nearest town was. I felt relieved when I saw there was one just a few miles down the road, and I told my boyfriend to press the gas so we could get there and call 911. When we rolled into town, the first place we saw was a small diner off the side of the highway called Albert Kitchen. We pulled into the parking lot, and I nearly stumbled as I rushed from the car to the front doors. Once I was inside, every head in the place turned as I ran up to the counter and asked to use their phone. The woman behind the counter said, "Sure," and slid the phone toward me. I dialed 911 and asked to speak to the police. As I told the dispatcher what had happened, everyone in the diner listened in, and they gasped when I said that I had seen a child thrown down a well. The dispatcher told me to stay where I was so the sheriff could send a deputy over, and after I thanked her, I hung up. I was still shaking with adrenaline when I set the handset back into its cradle on the phone. When I turned around, every single person in the diner was staring straight at me. The woman behind the counter brought me a glass of ice water to help me calm down. Then, as my boyfriend and I waited for the police to arrive, a man stood up from his table and started walking toward us. He introduced himself and began asking about the burned-out fields we had seen. When I explained what we'd witnessed and how every field for miles was blackened and charred, he turned to another diner and asked if those fields belonged to someone. Art Landry was the name I remember him saying. He then asked me to describe the man I had seen. Everyone seemed to agree that it must have been Art Landry, and that his grandkids had been staying with him that week because their parents were out of town. The room filled with shock, mixed with deep confusion. They clearly knew this Art Landry well, So hearing that he had done something so terrible was hard for them to accept. They asked me more than once if I was sure. When I said I had never been more certain of anything in my life, a quiet wave of, "Oh my God" and "Dear Lord" moved through the room. I'm not sure how much time passed before a deputy finally arrived to speak with us. When he did, we stepped outside to our car so we could talk in detail away from the people in the diner. I told the whole story again and got the same reaction from the deputy, as if what I was saying sounded nearly impossible or absurd. While he was still asking questions, another patrol car pulled into the parking lot and the county sheriff stepped out, having driven all the way from headquarters to speak with us. The deputy spared me from telling the story a fourth time by explaining exactly what I had seen to the sheriff. The sheriff reacted the same way, muttering in disbelief before walking off to speak into his radio for a few minutes. When he came back, he told us that someone at headquarters had already called Art Landry to ask him about what I had seen. Now, Art didn't know what I was talking about and said that while his grandson was staying with him that week, they hadn't been anywhere near those burned-out cornfields. By then, I was practically begging the sheriff to drive us back down the highway so I could show him exactly which well I had been talking about. He said he couldn't just walk onto someone's land like that without a warrant, and that he would have to speak with Art Landry personally before anything like that could happen. I tried to keep my cool. I knew the longer we talked, the less chance that kid had of surviving the fall. Not to mention whatever might have been down there at the bottom of the well. If it was water, he could drown. If it was dry, then we needed to get him out as soon as possible before he died. I tried to explain all of that as clearly as I could, but the more worked up I became, the more the sheriff and his deputies started to look at me like I was losing my mind. I had to literally beg the sheriff before he finally told his deputy to drive out to the old well on that farm and check it out. When he did, I was so genuinely thankful that I almost broke down in tears. The entire time we were waiting, my boyfriend kept telling me it was going to be okay and that everything would be fine. The sheriff was leaning against his car, half sitting on it, talking into his radio. Then, all at once, he stood up and walked over to us, calling out that he had some good news. First, the well on that farm was empty. Second, Art Landry was on his way to the diner with his grandson, so I could see for myself that everything was fine. I was speechless for a moment, because I was certain, and still am, about what I saw out there. The sheriff took that moment to explain that I must have simply been mistaken. Who I had seen was probably just someone lifting their kid to show them the bottom of the well. Any dropping or falling I thought I saw was likely some kind of optical illusion caused by how fast we were driving through the smoke. The only thing I could manage to ask, once my voice came back, was how the deputy could be so sure the well was empty. Was he absolutely certain there wasn't a kid down there, maybe underwater or just beyond the reach of his flashlight? I knew what I saw. There was a kid's life at stake, and I wasn't about to just take someone else's word for it, especially when they kept throwing around phrases like optical illusion or trick of the light, which sounded more and more suspicious to me the more they repeated it. I understood that people in small towns tend to protect their own, but the way they didn't even seem to care about this kid shifted from alarming to genuinely disturbing. As I tried to keep my cool and stay polite while explaining to the sheriff that I knew what I had seen, the deputy came back from checking the well. Right behind him was a beat-up old truck, and when it rolled to a stop, a big, older man in dungarees stepped out, his dark hair thin and receding. The first thing he said was something like, "Now who's this saying I didn't drop my damn grandson down a well?" He sounded angry, and the sheriff walked over saying, "Hey now, just hold on, Art. She's just trying to help." The man, Art, then walked around to the passenger side of his truck, opened the door, and helped a young boy out of the seat. He led him over to us so we could see and told me in a harsh, accusatory tone that this was the boy I was supposedly claiming he'd thrown down the well. My boyfriend quietly said, "See, I told you everything'd be fine," in a gentle, reassuring way. But things were not fine. The kid I had seen had blonde, curly hair, and the child standing in front of us had dark hair cut close to his head. I started getting more frantic as I explained that it wasn't the same kid. The deputy tried telling me that maybe the sun had caught his hair in a way that made it look blonde. Having them try to make me feel like I was crazy made me want to scream, but I knew that wouldn't help my case. Instead, I asked if there was anyone else I could talk to, because I didn't feel like they were being very helpful. While the deputy and I were talking, the sheriff asked my boyfriend if they could speak in private. A few minutes later, my boyfriend came back and said we needed to leave. The sheriff basically asked if I was crazy. When my boyfriend said no, he told me to get out of town before I was arrested for public disturbance. They could not have people just rolling into town, throwing around accusations, and dirtying a good man's name. So unless we had any other official business to attend to, we were to leave immediately or face arrest. By that point, I actually wanted to leave. I had a horrible, creeping feeling that something dark was going on in that small town. But whatever it was, neither of us was getting to the bottom of it in the parking lot of that damn diner. I faked an apology to the farmer and his grandson, whoever the poor kid was. Then, the second we were back on the road and I had some reception, I called the Iowa State Patrol to report the whole thing. I told them I thought something messed up was happening in that town, specifically on the farm of one Art Landry. But they got back to me saying there was nothing to it. I went through the entire complaints process, saying I did not think my report was being handled properly. Again, they responded that they had done everything they could, but there was still nothing to report. But I know what I saw. I had never had any kind of hallucinations before or since. I do not need glasses, and no, I am not crazy. My dad used to work for the Foreign Office, and he met my mom while working in Peru. My mom's heritage is really important to her, so things like Peruvian food and music were a big part of my childhood. We only visited once when I was a kid, so in my late 20s, I decided I would fly over to visit relatives and explore my mother country a little. I was driving on a small back road in the middle of nowhere, trying to find the town where my relatives lived, when I suddenly saw flashing lights in my rear view. The Peruvian police were pulling me over for some reason. Not wanting to cause trouble, I pulled over quickly and got ready to use my very rusty Spanish. But instead of getting out of his car and walking over slowly with his shades on like in American movies, the officer took a defensive stance behind his open car door and started hailing me over his loudspeaker, telling me to stick my hands out of the window. Immediately, I was panicking because I had barely seen a gun in real life before, let alone had one pointed at me. And then, as I'm shouting at this policeman that I'm unarmed and terrified, he's acting like I'm some hardened criminal, telling me to shut my mouth as he slowly approaches my window. He has his gun right in my face while trying to put cuffs on me one-handed before calling for backup, to the point that one slip of his trigger finger would have left my brains decorating the passenger seat. And as he's doing that, even more police cars start showing up before they literally drag me out of the car and take me off to jail. Being in that jail cell was probably the single lowest point of my entire life. The police kept throwing around words like murderer, violator, and hurting children. One of them even gasped and said, "That's him." As I was led through the station, I had these waking daylight nightmares about being locked in a foreign country for something I didn't do. That feeling was made even worse by the occasional policeman coming over to harass me through the bars of my cell. I kept trying to tell them that I was British and only there on holiday, but they responded by saying I should stop talking before they stopped me themselves. Terrible stuff like that. This went on for a couple of hours, and I honestly thought my life was over. Then, out of the blue, someone unlocked my cell and told me there had been a mistake, and I was suddenly free to go. Walking out of that police station felt completely unreal. I was shaking like a chihuahua, while the police either laughed about the mix-up or offered apologies that didn't come close to covering what I'd been through. They acted like they had ticketed the wrong car, not dragged me into a station at gunpoint. Still, I was just glad to be on my way. I was relieved, but I was furious too. I couldn't show it, not if I wanted to avoid giving them a reason to lock me up again. Before I left, they showed me a picture of the man they had confused me with. He was a violent, wanted criminal, a truly dangerous individual, and looking at his photo felt like staring almost into a mirror. It was easily the most terrifying experience of my life. When I later told my relatives and mentioned the idea of any compensation, they just laughed and said, "No chance." I had an amazing time overall and don't regret going, but I also haven't been back to Peru since. Next time, my family will be picking me up from the bloody airport. The worst day of my life was a Sunday, and it happened in a small town called Windsor along the eastern North Carolina coast. Back then, Windsor was home to fewer than 2,000 people and was your typical backwoods North Carolina town. We had a grocery store, a gas station, a Bojangles, and the peanut factory. Aside from a few churches and chapels that ringed the town, that was pretty much it. It was quiet and neighborly. Murder was not a word you ever heard spoken in Windsor, and you only heard it on the radio or on television. But then came that night in 1993, when all that evil stepped out of the TV and took a walk around town. It was the evening of June 6th, and I was down at the Hawthorne County Sheriff's Office, about a mile south of town. The Hawthorne County Jail sits down there as well. After collecting some paperwork from one of the deputies, I was sitting at my desk, quietly filling it out, when we suddenly heard dispatch crackle over our radios. It was the quietest day of the week, so I do not think anyone expected more than a civil dispute or a minor accident. So when we heard the codes for a man with a gun or multiple deaths, there was a brief moment when I was convinced there had been some kind of mistake. But when I saw my fellow deputies running out of the office and toward their cars, I knew there was no mistake. It was real. I followed them into the parking lot, climbed into my cruiser, and we sped off in a rough convoy toward the grocery store on the north side of town. The store was called B-Low, a play on the words below, referring to low prices, and it also served as a common gathering place, much like the local churches where people met and talked. Knowing the 3 deceased were most likely people I knew, maybe even friends, was already a heavy weight as we rushed toward the store. When we arrived, the place was closed and locked since it shut early on Sundays, and we still had almost no idea what to expect. The 911 call that reached dispatch came from a wounded survivor of whatever had happened. They were in so much pain that they could not give many details. All we knew was that there were bodies, a man with a gun, and survivors who desperately needed our help. The B-Low had glass panel windows running the full length of the front. On the approach, you could see a long trail of blood stretching from the front to the back of the store. After we forced our way inside, we found that all the blood belonged to a member of B-Low's cleaning crew, who had crawled from the back of the store with gunshot wounds so we could use the phone. The other deputies and I spread out once we were inside, clearing the place aisle by aisle to make sure no one was waiting to ambush us. When we reached the back of the store, we found 5 more people. 3 of them were dead, and another was badly wounded with stab injuries. For some reason, the killer had left the 5th person, another member of the cleaning crew, completely unharmed. There was no helping most of those who had been shot. We did what we could for Michael Reed, and thankfully, he survived. While EMS worked to get the wounded airlifted to the hospital, we heard the full story of what had happened from the one member of the cleaning crew who walked away covered in blood, but without a single scratch. It was every bit as bad as we feared. Every Sunday, a cleaning crew would stop by the below to wax the floors and get them ready for the next week. At closing time, around 6 p.m., once the customers were gone, the store manager let the crew inside and locked the doors behind them. As the crew started moving mats and preparing their buffers, the last remaining store clerk saw a person she did not recognize step out from one of the aisles. She assumed it was a customer who had missed the closing announcement, but when she approached him and told him the store was closed, he raised a gun and pointed it at her face. The cleaning crew was at the front of the store at that moment, and the man moved on the clerk so quietly that they never noticed anything was wrong. As he forced the clerk toward the back office, they remained completely unaware. Once inside the office, the gunman ordered the manager to hand over all the cash on site. He had chosen the timing carefully, right at the end of the week. We later confirmed that he left with a few $1,000s in cash, along with several money orders totaling another $3,000. But instead of leaving once he had the cash, the gunman ordered the manager and the clerk back onto the shop floor, and then rounded up the cleaning crew as well. I did not see exactly what the victims were bound with, but I later learned it was dog leashes he grabbed from one of the aisles. After he moved all 6 of them to the back of the store, he ordered them to tie each other up at gunpoint. He tied the last person up himself. Michael Reed told us that once everyone was restrained, he thought the ordeal was over. The man had his money, everyone was tied up so they could not call the police right away. There was no reason for what he did next, but he did it anyway. That was when everything began to fall apart. The gunman started stacking people in pairs, ordering them to lie on top of each other. Before anyone could understand why, he said, "God forgive me for what I am about to do." And then he began firing into the stacks. He only managed to fire a few shots before the gun either jammed or ran out of ammunition. When he ran off, Michael Reed thought for a second time that it was finally over. Seconds later, the gunman came running back with a knife he had grabbed from somewhere. He asked Michael Reed if they were going to tell the police about him. Michael Reed said no. So did the man lying on top of him, who we later learned was Michael Reed's brother. As they tried to convince him they would not report him, the gunman lost control and began stabbing the brother with the knife. He cut the man's throat from ear to ear and kept stabbing him in the back until the blade snapped off inside his body. Michael Reed said the gunman then asked him again if he would identify him to the police if given the chance. When he said no a second time, the gunman walked out with the money and left the last man alive. Michael Reed was convinced the man would return, just as he had before when he went to get the knife. His brother's body was still on top of him, and there was no way he could have moved, even if he wanted to. The only other surviving member of the cleaning crew, believing everyone else was dead, managed to free himself from the dog leash. He crawled toward the front of the store, where we found him, with the phone still clutched in his hand. When it came to the investigation that followed, I don't remember ever being so invested in a case before. One of the people who was killed was a relative of the county sheriff, so he made it a personal mission to bring the man in. But right from the beginning, things started to go wrong. First, the below security camera system wasn't working at the time of the attack. A repair technician had already been scheduled for the following week. And while the timing of that still haunts me, it meant we had no security footage of the suspect. Second, all 3 survivors gave the same description of the man, and it was a distinct one. He was said to have a crooked nose and hazel eyes, but the sketches we circulated didn't lead to any sightings. No solid ones, at least. All we had were reports of a white sedan with Maryland plates speeding out of town on the 17th. It wasn't right after the murders, though. And once the car was located, its owner was cleared of any involvement. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think the most frustrating part was how the investigation became fixated on one detail that I'm not even sure was true. At one point, one of the victims asked the killer why he was doing this. She was referring to them being stacked on top of one another, but the man must have taken it as a broader question, like why he was robbing them. He said something about being a former cop who had recently been fired. But it became clear early on that he couldn't have been a cop, since there was no fingerprint match, even though the lead investigators were convinced he was either former military or former law enforcement. That directly contradicted what people like me came to believe, which was that he was a fugitive who killed because he didn't want any witnesses. By the time the investigation seriously considered that possibility, the killer could have already escaped the country using the thousands of dollars he stole. That's my best guess as to why he was never caught. Afterward, people in law enforcement talked about what happened as if it were a tornado. They described it as a terrible, almost random event that no one could have stopped. But I still felt useless. The worst thing to happen in Windsor in maybe 200 years. And I've been sitting on my ass, buried in paperwork, while some sick bastard was stacking bodies and blowing their brains out two at a time. But what I still can't figure out is why he let the last victim live. Michael Reed told us the killer said it plainly, "I'm going to let you live." That alone makes my fugitive theory feel a little shaky. Part of me thinks he just got tired of killing, and he couldn't bring himself to stab a second person to death after killing what he believed were 4 others. But then there's another part of me, the one that thinks he left someone alive so they could tell everyone what happened, because he wanted people to know what he did and how he did it, so he could maybe read about it in the papers later. I try not to dwell on that thought, because when I do, the pain of never catching that guy cuts even deeper. I grew up in a place called Bart Township in rural Pennsylvania. Bart is about as rural as it gets, especially around nickel mines, where I was raised, an area home to a large community of Old Order Amish. And if you're thinking of Old Order Amish who practice Rumspringa or use flip phones because they're considered essential technology, this was not that group. They were so strict, they still referred to anyone who wasn't Old Order Amish as English. And that was my childhood, living like we were aliens in our own country. But I didn't know any different, so I was happy, right up until October 2nd, 2006. Like most kids my age, I dropped out of school after 8th grade to help my dad on the farm. That morning we were working together while my little brother was at school. Everything felt normal, just another day on the farm, when all of a sudden my dad said, "Is that your brother?" I looked up and saw a small figure in the distance, running down the tracks toward our farmhouse, and I knew it was him. Dad then said, "What the hell is he doing out of school?" Because it was only 11 in the morning. I followed as he marched toward the house to see what was wrong. When we got there, we found my little brother in tears, with my mom holding him. Dad still believed he'd just run away from school, so the anger was still there, simmering, waiting to surface. But when my little brother finally managed to get the words out and tell us why he had run home from school, I remember it felt like time stopped for a few seconds. He told us there was a man in their classroom and that he had a gun. If you can believe it, that was not even the scariest part. Because as my dad was panicking and rushing to grab his own gun, my little brother said something about the man having chains and hooks too. That was enough. A red mist came over my dad, and he ran off toward the old schoolhouse, telling me to stay put and watch my mom and my brother. We had to wait for hours before Dad finally came back with news of what had happened. And when he did, this is what he told us. At around 10:30 that morning, Not long after the kids came back from recess, a pickup truck parked in front of the old schoolhouse. A man got out, walked inside, and asked the kids' teacher if she had found a clevis pin out in the road. A clevis pin is kind of like a bolt, something used to fasten two things together. They are commonly used in farming, so almost everyone around those parts knows what one is. Since the kids' teacher had not seen one that morning, she apologized for not being able to help, but wished the man luck in finding his missing pin. The man acted strange. He did not make any eye contact, and he mumbled some kind of reply before walking back to his truck. But a minute later, he came back into the schoolhouse with a pistol and told everyone that they would either do what he said or they were going to die. Thinking it was some kind of robbery, the kids' teacher told the class to do what the man said. But instead of taking the school's petty cash box and leaving, the man ordered all the young boys there, including my brother, to help him unload items from his truck and carry them into the classroom. They brought in a large number of tools, a shotgun and a stun gun, but also a big stack of lumber, along with wires, chains, and what we later learned were metal eye hooks. The man wanted to force the kids to watch what he planned to do to them. But while he was supervising the unloading of his truck, the kids' teacher made a run for it and managed to reach a nearby farmer who called 911. The guy knew that the teacher had gotten away, so he ordered one of the boys to go bring them back, and then went about barricading the schoolhouse doors, using the lumber and nails the boys had carried inside. When he finished, the guy allowed 3 parents, including a pregnant woman from what I heard, and all the boys in the class to leave. Then after that, he made all the girls line up against the chalkboard, like he was some kind of one-man firing squad. The first cop car arrived at the schoolhouse just minutes after that farmer's 911 call. Knowing what was happening, the cop used his loudspeaker to plead with the armed men to put down his weapons and allow the girls to leave. Around the same time, the man called 911 himself and told the dispatcher that if the cops made a move on him, he would execute the girls. He said all of this right in front of them, so those poor girls knew exactly what was coming and were begging him not to hurt them. 2 of the girls even asked to be shot first, possibly hoping it would spare the lives of the other kids lined up beside them. But the man told them to be quiet and kept on talking to the cops. Dad said that by 11 a.m., there was a whole crowd gathered around the schoolhouse perimeter, and that a bunch of ambulances were there too, waiting to treat the wounded. They all heard when the shooting started, and Dad said the sound that rose up from the crowd was like nothing he had ever heard before. Just this terrible noise of collective mourning, as each gunshot meant a lost life and hearts that would never fully heal. As the gunshots started popping off, all the cops rushed the schoolhouse, hoping to put a stop to the massacre. But the man realized what was happening and started shooting at the cops out of a window. They returned fire, being careful to only target the window he was shooting from. The man stopped firing, and they figured he was either hit or reloading. But when they burst into the schoolhouse, they found him dead on the floor, with a single self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. We later found out that just before the shooting began, the man tried to call his wife to say goodbye. I don't think she answered the phone, but he must have left a message, because when she got home from wherever she had been, the first thing she saw was a note on the table explaining what her husband had planned to do that day. She also called 911, hoping to stop what was about to happen before it ever started. But by then, it was far too late, and her husband was only minutes away from murdering a group of innocent children. All of the wounded girls were taken to the hospital, but out of the 10 kids who were shot that morning, only 4 survived. A couple were pronounced dead at the scene. I also heard that one little girl died in the arms of a state trooper as he tried to comfort her. They were all between 6 and 13 years old. For some reason, in the middle of the massacre, the man decided to switch from using a pistol to using a shotgun. He still had ammunition left in the pistol, too. Because of that, many people believe he changed weapons to cause more damage and make the scene even more horrific than it already was. No one could understand why someone would do that. Killing them was one thing, but deliberately making it as brutal as possible felt like a kind of evil I knew I would never fully understand. But after we learned who did it, and more importantly, why he did it, things began to make a twisted kind of sense. First, finding out who killed all those kids was a huge shock, because nearly everyone in the nickel mines area and the surrounding towns knew who he was. His name was Charlie Roberts, and he lived down in Georgetown. He was a milk tank driver who visited many local farms, sometimes several times a week. He actually knew the families of some of the children he killed, and at the time of the massacre, he had a wife and 3 kids of his own. The cops talked to his co-workers about him, and they said that while Charlie had a history of depression and similar issues, he seemed noticeably different in the days leading up to the massacre. But this was most likely because he had decided he was going to kill a bunch of people, and that decision made him feel better about himself. The cops also believed he may have been inspired by a similar hostage situation that had happened in Colorado during the same week. Obviously, there was no way to get a solid answer on that, because he was already dead. But he laid out almost exactly what drove him to kill those kids, in the notes he left behind, and in the message he recorded on his wife's voicemail that morning. It turned out Charlie Roberts had been hurting children in many ways, and had abused 2 female relatives of his when he was 12. He told his wife that he had been daydreaming about doing it again, and that also explained the lubrication the cops found at the scene. But Charlie also claimed that the death of his daughter was the reason he claimed drove him to commit the massacre. He and his wife had lost their little girl during childbirth about 10 years earlier, and he wrote in one of his notes that he was filled with hate toward himself and toward God because of her death. His 2 female relatives said that the whole abuse story was completely made up, but I could see them saying that simply because they wanted their privacy and all of that. Either way, people started saying that Charlie wasn't really that kind of person, and that he was just insane because he didn't actually touch any of those girls at the schoolhouse. He just killed them in cold blood before taking the coward's way out. And over the week or so that followed, the schoolhouse was knocked down and flattened so it wouldn't remind anyone of what had happened. And while the reaction of the local old order Amish made me proud in a lot of ways, it was also the beginning of me realizing that I wasn't like them and that I couldn't stay. For example, one of the first things people did was reach out to Charlie's dad, who, as you can imagine, was absolutely devastated after learning what his son had gone and done. They told him they forgave his son for what he'd done, and a lot of folks even went to Charlie's funeral as a show of support for his heartbroken family. I thought that part was understandable because it clearly wasn't Charlie's parents' fault that their son had gone insane. But the thing that still didn't sit right with me was how people chose to forgive Charlie as well. Old order Amish people were taught not to hold grudges. Even so, I couldn't find it in myself to forgive a man who had brought lubrication into a schoolhouse full of girls in single-digit ages and then ended their lives. There was this quiet attitude that if you could forgive the man who did it, it somehow made you a better Christian. So when it came to the idea of prevention, of stopping something like that from ever happening again, people said things like, "It's in the hands of God now. It's up to the Almighty alone to protect us." I remember someone else saying they were glad Charlie Roberts had taken his own life, because it meant he'd already been judged by God by the time we were laying those girls to rest. They believed that if he repented before God, he would be forgiven for all of his sins. But the more I thought about that, the more I felt like I no longer belonged among the old order. And now it's been almost 10 years since I left nickel mines behind me.